I've been commissioned to tell the story of the Ruskin book. Several people have been asking me about it. So I'll start by just quickly telling the story of a large folio volume that is in the collection of special collections, that is in the exhibit that at the Feuchtwanger room of the Ruskin Art Club archives. Well, it's a large folio book, I think 1735. It is a catalog of the art holdings of the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. Each hand-drawn page of the shape of the room, and then all the art in each of the rooms, in position, in situ, page by page. It's extraordinary volume. This volume was found in the old Ruskin, when we had a clubhouse, a 1922 clubhouse in the Wilshire area. This clubhouse had an office, and it was found on a desk in the office, behind it actually, swathed in T-shirts. It came as a result of my asking one of my fellow officers, have we ever moved this desk? Has this desk ever been moved? So behind the desk there was this T-shirted 18th century folio volume, which to our delight turned out to be from Ruskin's Brantwood collection. How it got to be on Plymouth and 3rd in Mid-Wilshire area, we don't know. We do know why it was behind the desk, however. The club needed a new roof. The directors of the club were busily selling various valuable historic items in their archive to pay for the roof. Someone thought this volume should not be among the volumes and hid it behind the desk. So anyway, that's the story of the Ruskin book. We're always pleased to be back here at USC for our annual Ruskin lecture and to be working with our friends at Special Collections here at the Doheny Library. The Ruskin Art Club is LA's oldest cultural association, dating back to 1888. In fact, next year we will celebrate our 130th anniversary. Throughout that long history, in various ways, we have been associated with USC, and not least through this ongoing lecture series. Let me say something at the outset about the Ruskin lecture itself. While it would be interesting and valuable to focus on Ruskin himself, 19th century polymath, perhaps the century's greatest art critic and social thinker, one of the unacknowledged creators of the modern world, as one scholar has asserted, the point of this lecture series is somewhat broader than that. Each year in this Ruskin lecture, we have a chance to do what I like to call applied Ruskin. That is to reflect on a contemporary issue, on something that we're grappling with in the 21st century, and to see what light Ruskin's ideas or like-minded thinkers might shed on those questions that we're facing today. So I suppose in this lecture series, Ruskin is not so much the last word as the starting point of the discussion, the first installment of which will follow this lecture. So please, when the lecture is over, please stay. Part of the delight of these events is really having a chance to engage not only with the lecturer, but with one another, and to really have a chance to begin to unpack some of the themes that we're dealing with. We're so pleased that Professor Amy Woodson-Boulton has agreed to speak to us tonight on a topic that could hardly be timelier, Ruskin's truths in the age of fake news. Amy spoke earlier today in a conversation with Sharon Lloyd, sponsored by the Levin Institute for Humanities and Ethics, on truth as a public good. So it's been a busy day, and I should add a busy month. Professor Woodson-Boulton, with a number of us, will be taking this topic on the road, so to speak, for a one-day symposium on the relevance of Ruskin and Morris's ideas to the political and cultural challenges of our times in San Francisco on September 23rd. And you'll find information on that in your programs, and there's also, I believe, a flyer which gives more details about that upcoming symposium in San Francisco. Amy comes to us from Loyola Marymount University, where she's an associate professor of British and Irish history. Her interest in Ruskin stems from her work on cultural reactions to industrialization, particularly the history of art museums and the social role of art and the changing status and meaning of art and nature in modern society. She is a companion of the Guild of St. George, the charity Ruskin founded in 1871. There are a few others of us here who are proud and privileged to be companions of the Guild, and not incidentally, a member of the Ruskin Art Club. So without further ado, Professor Woodson-Boulton.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, and the Ruskin Art Club for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here. And so exciting to share. This paper was, this lecture was much easier to write than I thought it maybe was going to be. I realized I had a lot more to say about Ruskin in the age of fake news than maybe I realized even. So what do the writings of John Ruskin have to offer us in this moment of suspicion, partisanship, and fears of fake news? Well, sorry, my computer is just telling me it's time for the lecture, which I should maybe. All right, good. It's right. What do the writings of John Ruskin have to offer us in this moment of suspicion, partisanship, and fears of fake news across the political spectrum? We decry our fraying social fabric, fear for the health of our democracy, and doubt our ability to navigate rapid cultural, technological, and environmental change. Aggravating our anxiety, we can't seem to access a reality or gain a perspective unmediated by technology or partisan interpretation. The nagging sense that our traditional and social media are awash in fake news, foreign manipulation, lurking hackers, malicious malware, and duplicitous algorithms highlights our sense of disconnect. We cannot even seem to agree on what it is that we all disagree about, let alone come together to find solutions. We increasingly seem to consume our democratic institutions in terms once reserved for leisure and entertainment, and there seems to be no clear distinctions between politics and popular culture, or between the hard work of citizenship and the fast-moving power of celebrity. While I can't offer you a clear way out of this conundrum, I can try to offer you a pause to consider these categories of true and false, real and fake, authentic and imitation, and to reflect on their longer history. Such questions might seem unique to our strange political and cultural moment, but actually these precise categories have shaped critiques of modern, mechanized, capitalist society for nearly 200 years. Why have so many social critics pinpointed this particular source of anxiety? What can earlier thinkers teach us about our shared historical moment? And how can their acts of witness to their own societies, which they also perceived as being in crisis, help us gain perspective on ours? In short, why does modern life feel like an unending search for the true, the natural, and the real? Of course, many human societies in the past have understood our universe through these same categories of true and false, real and fake, authentic and imitation. For example, for millennia, Hindus and Buddhists have considered our physical world as hiding a deeper ultimate reality, and Plato famously understood us to perceive only a partial, shadowed rendering of the real. However, I am not addressing that broader philosophical or theological question this evening. Rather, tonight I want to engage with these distinctions historically, investigating specific concerns with the fake that emerged about 150 years ago. Over and over again, 19th century novelists, artists, and social critics came back to the problems of falsity, appearance, hypocrisy, surface, hollowness, veneer, to the particular problem of representation in shaping their world, which led to a frantic and pervasive search for authenticity. As we are now painfully aware, the search for the real and authentic has come to permeate much contemporary cultural and political discourse. The Victorian period, in its own search for origins, created its own scientific certainties. For example, that nations were natural, fundamental entities that arose from land, blood, language, religion, and history, and that people are born into biologically defined categories of race and gender. Over the last couple of generations, however, scholars and social movements have come to see such essentialisms as human-created systems. Civil rights activists, anti-imperialists, and feminists have worked hard to question these long-dominant truths as being facts that lie outside of human control. Scholars such as Benedict Anderson called nations imagined communities, and Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger showed how they arose and have been maintained through invented traditions. Much contemporary debate now swirls around rethinking these institutions, systems, and narratives, but in tackling this issue, many have now come to question our ability to connect with any reality or truth outside of human invention at all. Truth was, in fact, a crucial aspect of John Ruskin's critique of his own society, and it has remained at the heart of many of the most trenchant social and political critiques over the last 150 years or so. I'm not claiming that Ruskin is important because he was the first to say these things, or because of a specific genealogy of thought that leads directly to us today. Rather, I find him fascinating because he was an extraordinarily attentive witness to changes in England in the second half of the 19th century, changes that deeply resemble and in fact helped to create the conditions for our own economy, politics, society, and culture. Born in 1819, Ruskin observed the rise and triumph of political liberalism, that is, the political philosophy of the free market, and the continuing effects of industrial capitalism, the explosive growth of cities, commodities, nationalism, technology, and spectacle, as well as of poverty, class conflict, imperialism, pollution, and alienation. As we will see, Ruskin understood this society in terms of complex and interconnected factors, and in his dense and poetic writings, he brought together capitalism, industrial production, inequality, consumption, alienation, nature, beauty, truth, and meaning. Ruskin's keen eyes and sharp mind zeroed in on the effects of this transformation, on the material culture, art, and architecture of his period, as well as on social and political structures. And crucially, he saw all of these changes as interconnected. What Ruskin noticed, what we are going to consider today, are the particular relationships that people in an industrial capitalist society developed with the built and natural environment, with their physical surroundings and possessions, and how this new political, economic, and social system manifested itself in art, architecture, and design that in ways directly related to these questions of true and false, real and fake, authentic and imitation. Engaging with Ruskin is a kind of time travel. We get to go back to a world that is going to seem very strange, but also strangely familiar. To try to understand industrial capitalism is to enter into a world of proliferating mirrors that is our cycle of production, advertising, consumption, desire, and identity, as well as our deliberate erasure and denial of the true costs of this cycle and the hyperreality or simulacrum that we have entered. Ruskin calls our attention to the details of this process, to its operations. Holding on to truth in this ever-quickening and never-ending cycle of desire and appearance can seem impossible. By calling attention to this in his own time, Ruskin allows us to see our time more clearly by understanding that we are still part of this historical process. To understand Ruskin's critique of how industrial capitalism changed our relationship with our material culture, I want to start by considering the laminate wood shelving that is next to me in my office. It doesn't have to be laminate wood shelving. You're welcome to choose any imitation material you like, either one that you live with, or one that you particularly admire, or one that you particularly despise. The key question here is to think of a material, such as laminate wood, that is meant to give the impression of being something else. The question is, why do we use these materials in our homes and workspaces? I assume that these shelves were less expensive for my university than real wood, but what function is the laminate itself serving? Or more precisely, if cost effectiveness is the function that their not being real wood is serving, what function is served by the shelves appearing to be wood? Ever since first reading Ruskin, this is a question that I find myself frequently asking. Why do we surround ourselves with so many objects pretending to be something else? How does this simulation contribute to our anxieties and discontents? And how can observing it help us understand our relationships to larger systems of meaning, consumption, identity, and desire? The university decided to put in laminate wood shelving because its reality as wood is not as important as the feeling that the object produces, the illusion of being wood. The sense that our material culture, the architecture that surrounds us, our physical world, does not need to be real, but exists only to be perceived as an emotional experience, is what connects Ruskin's writings about Victorian architecture to post-structuralists' critiques of Disneyland, and to our own contemporary fears about virtual reality, artificial intelligence, cloning, bots, social media, fake news, and the apparent demise of public discourse, and therefore of democracy, predicated on a shared relationship to truth. To understand the connections between these disparate critiques of the fake, let's begin with Ruskin's attempts to search for truth in the middle of the 19th century. When Ruskin started to write for a broad public audience in the 1840s, all of the tremendous upheaval that we associate with the phrase industrial revolution was continuing to shake up British social, cultural, and political institutions. It was an era dominated by profound class conflict, by rapid urbanization with all of its related problems, and by the new political debates that these conditions created, particularly around one of the most pressing modern political questions: what is the role of government? At the same time, the 1840s were also dominated by the public exposure of these same social ills, as in the industrial novels by writers like Benjamin Disraeli, Elizabeth Gaskell, and Harriet Martineau, or in Friedrich Engels' path-breaking study of the condition of the working class in England that would do so much to shape the thinking of Karl Marx. The Reform Act of 1832 had dashed working class hopes by only expanding voting rights to a narrow band of the bourgeoisie. With the rise of these newly empowered industrialists and capitalists, political debates increasingly focused on issues like the needs of industry and the establishment of free trade. In short, Ruskin came of age intellectually during the ascendance of liberalism, that is, the political philosophy of free trade, which encouraged the increasing acceptance of market values, which defined government primarily as an arbiter and aid to market growth. The Opium Wars in China, the abolition of inflated grain prices in Britain, the government's response to the Great Hunger in Ireland, the management of the abolition of slavery in the West Indies, all of these were connected by a new understanding of government as a force whose principal function was to cultivate the conditions through which the invisible hand of the market could create and distribute wealth to the deserving. In his recent book, *Sapiens*, historian Yuval Noah Harari has written of this shift and the impact of money on human cultures. Quote, "When everything is convertible and when trust depends on anonymous coins and cowrie shells, it corrodes local traditions, intimate relations, and human values, replacing them with the cold laws of supply and demand." In his 1840 essay on the working class movement, Chartism, Ruskin's great friend and role model, Thomas Carlyle, despaired that cash payment had, quote, "grown to be the universal sole nexus of man to man." Into these swirling debates about class and capitalism, politics and morality came Ruskin, publishing books first about modern painters, then about Gothic architecture, and eventually quite explicitly about the problems of society. But from the outset, his works used their subjects to investigate and describe how he saw the art, architecture, and material culture of his society as embodying a new relationship to truth. Tonight, I want to call your attention to three different kinds of truth that I see as particularly meaningful in Ruskin's works. First, the idea that artists must find truth by first learning to see the world through their own eyes, not through preconceptions or convention, but embracing a radical truth to nature. Second, the idea that industrial capitalism consistently undermines the truth of both raw materials and the conditions of production by emphasizing superficial appearances, undermining what he called truth to materials. And finally, the idea that all instances of human creativity contain the history and morality of their conditions of production, and that it is up to all consumers to be aware of the truths behind what they consume, what we might call truth in production. So first, truth to nature. Ruskin's first major published work, Modern Painters, appeared in 1843. It arose from his deep connection and engagement with the paintings of J.M.W. Turner, but his explication of Turner's work led him to investigate and develop a general theory of art, vision, and morality. This theory contained what might seem to be the contradictory approaches to the idea of truth. On the one hand, he wanted to teach people to see, to carefully observe and interpret what was actually before them, not what they hoped or expected to see, their everyday objects, the buildings that surrounded them, and paintings they might encounter, as well as the nature that those depicted. But Ruskin also understood the visible world as meaningful for what lay behind or beyond, so that the best paintings, he wrote, quote, give inner and deeper resemblance to nature. What he wanted was seemingly impossible, to capture the beauty of natural form while hinting at the unseen metaphysical truth it revealed. But he found this unique combination in Turner, and from his profound encounter with Turner's controversial and unconventional paintings, Ruskin began to articulate his deeply influential approach to art. The principle that Ruskin derived from Turner that would help give rise to the Pre-Raphaelite school of painting, the arts and crafts movement in architecture and design, and myriad others, was truth to nature. Above all, this meant abandoning academic convention, the stylized coloring and composition that abstracted nature and created a saleable work of art. Rather, Ruskin urged painters to faithfully record the infinite variety of divinely created natural form, from the geology of mountain ranges to the movement of water to the quality of light in a morning mist, what Ruskin called the depiction of, quote, a fullness as complete and mysterious as nature's. Ruskin disdained the painters who had shaped the academic tradition, such as 17th century Nicolas Poussin, who, he wrote, painted, quote, distances that were mere meaningless tricks of clever execution, which, when once discovered, the artist may repeat over and over again with mechanical contentment and perfect satisfaction, both to himself and to his superficial admirers. In contrast, Ruskin led the reader to the works of Turner, using this painting, Mercury and Argus, as an example. And this is a lengthy quote, so you can look at the painting as you are listening to Ruskin's words. Abundant beyond the power of the eye to embrace or follow, vast and various beyond the power of the mind to comprehend, there is yet not one atom in its whole extent and mass which does not suggest more than it represents, nor does it suggest vaguely, but in such a manner as to prove that the conception of each individual inch of that distance is absolutely clear and complete in the master's mind, a separate picture fully worked out, but yet clearly and fully as the idea is formed, just so much of it is given and no more as nature would have allowed us to feel or see, just so much as would enable a spectator of experience and knowledge to understand almost every minute fragment of separate detail, but appears to the unpracticed and careless eye just what a distance of nature's own would appear, an unintelligible mass.
Not one line out of the millions there is without meaning, yet there is not one which is not affected and disguised by the dazzle and indecision of distance. No form is made out, and yet no form is unknown. For Ruskin, then, the genius of Turner lay in his capturing the reality of nature, not through slavish imitation of each and every detail, but by replicating what the artist himself had seen through his eyes or in his mind's eye when he created the painting. Thus, Ruskin wrote elsewhere that if he could, he would rather have actual windows looking onto scenes than the paintings depicting them, meaning that the act of painting was to recapture the artist's vision and to see through his eyes. Later, in the third volume of Modern Painters, published in 1856, Ruskin more explicitly contrasted the assumptions of the Royal Academy and the grand style with his own theory of art. Where founding Royal Academy President Sir Joshua Reynolds had chided painters who slavishly and mechanically imitated nature and called on painters of genius to use their imaginations, Ruskin called on painters to see truth and to paint the real. The whole power, whether of painter or poet, to describe rightly what we call an ideal thing depends on its being thus to him not an ideal, but a real thing. Crucially, Ruskin wanted to do away with the insult that some painters were vulgar who attempted to depict what they saw in the way that they saw it. There is never vulgarity in a whole truth, however commonplace. It may be unimportant or painful. It cannot be vulgar. Vulgarity is only in concealment of truth or in affectation. Elsewhere, he wrote that the greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one. To see truly and depict truly what one sees, that is the end of all art, to use one's genius and imagination to capture the actual wonder of the universe. Indeed, for Ruskin, this was the highest goal of any person, and it was a profoundly moral and even political act. Seeing would reveal the reality of the burgeoning cities of industrial Britain, with all of their attendant physical and moral ugliness, just as it would uncover the contrasting beauty of nature with all of its deeper significance as the sign of something that transcends human perspective. In this sense, seeing meant refusing to accept cliched platitudes and justifications for poverty and suffering, just as it meant refusing to paint in the trite, conventionalized colors of the Royal Academy. Ruskin's exhortations to embrace a new kind of seeing would revolutionize the British art world, helping to create a market for emerging artists who challenged academic orthodoxy and influencing generations of writers, artists, designers, architects, and reformers, from William Morris to Kate Greenaway to Mohandas Gandhi to Marcel Proust. For Ruskin, as for so many reacting to industrial capitalism, nature became a touchstone in the search for capital T truth, because it represented divine creation. Quote, all great art is the expression of man's delight in God's work, not in his own. Truth to nature, then, was about challenging artistic conventions, but it was also a profound critique of the fundamental assumptions in Britain about the social role of art and about the social role of nature. Why has the idea of nature been so powerful in this modern search for truth, for the real and authentic? The romantic ideal of finding one's true self can sometimes seem to have turned into one extended advertisement for SUVs, and nature has certainly been aestheticized into a weekend excursion. I don't have time tonight to fully grapple with this question, but I do want to point out that thinking of modern cultural and political criticism in terms of truth can highlight the extent to which this place called nature has served, for many thinkers, as a system outside of the mirrors of signification and representation, that is, as the one remaining space, whether real or imagined, not dominated by the cash nexus or the logic of profit.
which brings us to truth to materials.
While modern painters emerged out of Ruskin's engagement with Turner, the Seven Lamps of Architecture, published in 1849, was the result of his investigation of Gothic architecture. The Seven Lamps continues his study of the meaning and morality of material culture, asking why the designs of past ages seemed qualitatively different than the productions of his own period. In seeking out general laws as to what constituted good architecture, Ruskin was explicit that he did so in the midst of tremendous change, including in the very purposes and types of buildings. He wrote, "There is no law, no principle based on past practice which may not be overthrown in a moment by the arising of a new condition or the invention of a new material, and the most rational, if not the only, mode of averting the danger of an utter dissolution of all that is systematic and consistent in our practice, or of ancient authority in our judgment, is to cease for a little while our endeavors to deal with the multiplying host of particular abuses, restraints, or requirements, and endeavor to determine as the guides of every effort some constant, general, and irrefragable laws of right, laws which, based upon man's nature, not upon his knowledge, may possess so far the unchangeableness of the one, as that neither the increase nor imperfection of the other may be able to assault or invalidate them." Ruskin was determined, in other words, to understand what architecture was and what rules architects could follow so that the productions of his own age, despite the proliferation of new kinds of buildings, could serve the same role as the architecture of past ages, namely, as he explained, as the art which so disposes and adorns edifices raised by man for whatsoever uses, that the sight of them may contribute to his mental health, power, and pleasure. Understanding architecture as an art as opposed to a technique or skill, and therefore defining it as the unnecessary elements of a building, Ruskin did not diminish its importance. Art, for Ruskin, was the highest aim of any civilization, and the highest society was one in which all citizens had access to shared beauty. The lamps that he proposed in the Seven Lamps of Architecture, rules or ideals for seeking beauty in the built environment, all highlighted elements of morality and guiding principles of the industrial capitalist society expanding all around him. Sacrifice, truth, power, beauty, life, memory, and obedience were in fact all social ideals he saw embodied in the architecture of primarily French and Italian late medieval cathedrals and palaces. Architecture for Ruskin was a society's values, expressed and preserved in stone. The buildings of his own time, he wrote, have, quote, constantly the look of money's worth, of a stopping short wherever and whenever we can, of a lazy compliance with low conditions, never of a fair putting forth of our strength. Let us have done with this kind of work. At once, cast off every temptation to do it. Do not let us degrade ourselves voluntarily and then mutter and mourn over our shortcomings. Let us confess our poverty or our parsimony, but not belie our human intellect. The question of honesty in architecture pervades the whole volume, but here we will focus on the lamp of truth, which takes us back to my laminate wood shelving. Ruskin sets up his discussion of truth in architecture in terms of the general acceptance of fakery that makes people hungry for authenticity. Quote, "It is not calumny nor treachery that do the largest sum of mischief in the world," Ruskin wrote. "They are continually crushed and are felt only in being conquered. But it is the glistening and softly spoken lie, the amiable fallacy, the patriotic lie of the historian, the provident lie of the politician, the zealous lie of the partisan, the merciful lie of the friend, and the careless lie of each man to himself that cast that black mystery over humanity, through which we thank any man who pierces, as we would thank one who dug a well in a desert, happy that the thirst for truth still remains with us, even when we have willfully left the fountains of it." Crucially, however, Ruskin does not see imagination as a lie, and he makes a key distinction. Quote, "The pleasure and nobility of the imagination partly consist in its knowledge and contemplation of them as such, i.e. in the knowledge of their actual absence or impossibility at the moment of their apparent presence or reality. It is a noble faculty so long as it confesses its own ideality. When it ceases to confess this, it is insanity. Pretending when you admit you are pretending is art. Pretending when you don't confess it is bad design or a political campaign." Ruskin laid out 3 types of architectural deceits. First, suggesting a false structure. Second, the painting of surfaces to represent some other material than that of which they actually consist, as in the marbling of wood, or the deceptive representation of sculptured ornament upon them. And third, the use of cast or machine-made ornaments of any kind. The idea of truth to materials proved to be one of Ruskin's most influential. Again, the evil for Ruskin, quote, "consists always in definitely attempted deception." As Ruskin writes about painting wood to look like marble, or mass-produced ornaments meant to look made by hand, or molding stucco to look like carved stone, he describes the architecture of the new cities, the increasingly mass-produced decoration for homes, churches, shops, train stations, hotels, offices, and factories, built in a proliferation of historical styles, for instance, Gothic for churches, classical for museums. We see quaint Victorian historicism. He saw something like Disneyland, but we'll get back to that later. Before leaving the subject of truth to materials, I want to highlight how Charles Dickens, another of the great realists, and someone whom John Ruskin greatly admired, also excoriated the culture of wealth, surface, and appearance in his novel Our Mutual Friend, published 1864-65. Famously, Dickens roasted the nouveau riche with his characters, the Veneerings, the brand new people in a brand new house in a brand new quarter of London, about whom everything was spick and span new. All their furniture was new, all their friends were new, all their servants were new, their plate was new, their carriage was new, their harness was new, their horses were new, their pictures were new, they themselves were new. They were as newly married as was lawfully compatible with their having a brand new baby, and if they had set up a great-grandfather, he would have come home in matting from the Pantechnicon without a scratch upon him, French polish to the crown of his head. This critique of newness certainly has a clear class dimension, an attack on the presumptions of the rising middle classes whose wealth and political power came from manufacturing. Dickens continues, "What was observable in the furniture was observable in the veneerings. The surface smelt a little too much of the workshop and was a trifle sticky." But Dickens goes on to show the veneerings as fundamentally unmoored, unconnected through any real or meaningful human relationships. Their emotional fakery is the essence of their superficial character. The problem is not just that their furniture is not real wood, but they do not seem to be real people or embedded in a real society. Dickens, in other words, shared Ruskin's metonymic reading of some of the ramifications of abandoning truth to materials. The pre-Raphaelite painter William Holman Hunt, explicitly following Ruskin, also sought to capture these relationships between material culture and moral failure in his 1853 painting, The Awakening Conscience, which Ruskin said captured the, quote, "fatal newness of the illicit lover's furnished rooms." For Ruskin, the ever-increasing materialism of his age valued cost over all considerations and had lost the essential habits and ideals that had created beauty in the built environment. He identified a key element of these ideals as truth, meaning commitment to showing the edifice's true structure, to only using materials that represent themselves, and to only using handmade original decorative elements. My laminate wood shelving is not obviously or aware or communicating its self-consciousness of the deception it perpetrates. It does not participate in its not being wood in a way that embraces its own act as one of the imagination, as it might if, for example, it was a beautiful color instead of pretend wood grain. Instead, the shelving communicates that the university cares about the bottom line, about getting its money's worth, while also wishing us to believe or feel that we are in a place that might have real wood, or perhaps aspires to have real wood. We have grown so used to these deceptions that perhaps they don't bother us, or perhaps we think they don't bother us. But our politics and culture constantly rehearse the search for the real, the authentic, the true. I wonder how much our built environment and material culture affects this. At the same time, we live in a society dominated by disposable commodities, usually produced in unknown conditions that we frequently suspect are doing great violence to the people who made them and to the natural environment, either in their production or in their disposal, or both. These ideas lead us to the final element of Ruskin's idea of truth that I want to highlight. That is, knowing the truth about our built environment and about where our stuff comes from, what we might call truth in production. In The Stones of Venice, published in 3 volumes, 1851 to 1853, Ruskin included a chapter on the nature of Gothic that returned to many of the themes he had touched on in The Seven Lamps. Here he defined and defended the Gothic specifically, rather than architecture in general, in terms of 6 elements: savageness, changefulness, naturalism, grotesqueness, rigidity, and redundance. It is savageness that interests me here because it is in his elaboration of this idea that Ruskin once again turned his observations of Gothic architecture into a critique of industrial capitalist society. Turning traditional academic architectural thinking on his head, he dismissed the Greek orders as seeking a perfection that was unnatural and turned the workers who built Greek temples into slaves. But of course his concern was not, or not only, with Greek stonemasons. His concern was the nature of mechanized labor. I quote here at length because of the beauty of this passage is part of its power. You must either make a tool of the creature or a man of him. You cannot make both. Men were not intended to work with the accuracy of tools, to be precise and perfect in all their actions. If you will have that precision out of them and make their fingers measure degrees like cogwheels and their arms strike curves like compasses, you must unhumanize them. All the energy of their spirits must be given to make cogs and compasses of themselves. All their attention and strength must go to the accomplishment of the mean act. The eye of the soul must be bent upon the finger point, and the soul's force must fill all the invisible nerves that guide it 10 hours a day, that it may not err from its steely precision, and so soul and sight be worn away, and the whole human being be lost at last, a heap of sawdust so far as its intellectual work is concerned, saved only by its heart, which cannot go into the form of cogs and compasses, but expands, after the 10 hours are over, into fireside humanity. On the other hand, if you will make a man of the working creature, you cannot make him a tool. Let him but begin to imagine, to think, to try to do anything worth doing, and the engine-turned precision is lost at once. Moreover, Ruskin urged his readers to apply these ideas to their own lives and living rooms, and to rethink their purchasing habits in order to use the power of consumer demand to change working conditions. This dehumanization in mechanized production, he wrote, can be met only by a right understanding on the part of all classes of what kinds of labor are good for men, raising them and making them happy, by a determined sacrifice of convenience or beauty or cheapness as is to be got only by the degradation of the workman, and by equally determined demand for the products and results of healthy and ennobling labor. And how, it will be asked, are these products to be recognized and this demand to be regulated? Easily, by the observance of 3 broad and simple rules. 1, never encourage the manufacture of any article not absolutely necessary, in the production of which invention has no share. 2, never demand an exact finish for its own sake, but only for some practical or noble end. 3, never encourage imitation or copying of any kind, except for the sake of preserving records of great works. Notice how these rules go directly against all modern economic thought, rejecting the division of labor and the free market. Ruskin also illustrates these rules with specific examples. For instance, he suggests that young ladies stop buying glass beads, as these are, quote, utterly unnecessary, and, quote, the men who chop up the glass rods sit at their work all day, their hands vibrating with a perpetual and exquisitely timed palsy, and the beads dropping beneath their vibration like hail. Neither they nor the men who draw out the rods or fuse the fragments have the smallest occasion for the use of any human faculty. Ruskin thus helped to popularize the idea that consumers should use their powers to shift markets and affect conditions of production, a question taken up from the 19th century through the present through, for example, the cooperative movement, fair trade, organic farming, and in myriad other ways. And part of what consumers crave here, and what the privileged can sometimes purchase, is truth in production. That is, that they are aware of the conditions of production and are not forced to pretend that their purchases are free of abuse or cruelty. Part of the suspension of disbelief that defines late capitalism is in fact the ignorance, whether inadvertent or deliberately cultivated, about where most of the things that we eat, wear, or use actually come from. The exception that proves this rule is that one of Ruskin's most avid later readers, and one of the few who truly took his teachings to heart and tried to live them, was Mohandas Gandhi. Even as his reputation grew, Ruskin increasingly despaired about the state of his society, and he became ever more explicit in his social and political criticism. Towns and organizations invited him to lecture, and he used these opportunities to generally scold his hosts and exhort them to fundamentally change their society. A good example of this occurred in 1864, when Ruskin went to the northern industrial city of Bradford, invited by the proprietors of the Bradford Exchange to discuss the architecture of their proposed new building. Ruskin was clear that this was a fairly ridiculous request. All good architecture, he said, is the expression of national life and character, and it is produced by a prevalent and eager national taste or desire for beauty. Moreover, he told them, good architecture is essentially religious, the production of a faithful and virtuous, not of an infidel and corrupted people. But what, he asked, was their religion? What architecture, in other words, could they produce? He wrote, now we have indeed a nominal religion to which we pay tithes of property and sevenths of time, but we have also a practical and earnest religion to which we devote 9/10 of our property and 6/7 of our time. And we dispute a great deal about the nominal religion, but we are all unanimous about this practical one, of which I think you will admit that the ruling goddess may be best generally described as the goddess of getting on, or Britannia of the market. And all of your great architectural works are, of course, built to her. It is long since you built a great cathedral, and how you would laugh at me if I proposed building a cathedral on top of one of these hills of yours to make it an acropolis. But your railway mounds, vaster than the walls of Babylon, your railroad stations, vaster than the temple of Ephesus, and innumerable, your chimneys, how much more mighty and costly than cathedral spires, your harbor piers, your warehouses, your exchanges, all these are built to your great goddess of getting on, and she has formed and will continue to form your architecture as long as you worship her, and it is quite vain to ask me to tell you how to build to her. You know far better than I. Here, then, Ruskin again urged people to see the truth behind their built environment, the political economy dictating how individuals, communities, and nations spend their money. What do our homes, workspaces, and cities tell us about our priorities and values? I know, he went on, that even all this wrong and misery are brought about by a warped sense of duty, each of you striving to do his best, but unhappily not knowing for whom this best should be done. And all our hearts have been betrayed by the modern economist, telling us that to do the best for ourselves is finally to do the best for others. Friends, our great master said not so, and most absolutely we shall find this world is not made so. Indeed, to do the best for others is finally to do the best for ourselves. Finally, Ruskin advised them that the only way to good building was to imagine a fairer and more just world, to make, quote, life good for all men as for yourselves. So in conclusion, The concepts of truth to nature, truth to materials, and truth in production can still serve as tools for understanding our society and our constant anxieties over truth, reality, and authenticity. Throughout the 20th century, many thinkers, including prominent post-structuralists Umberto Eco and Jean Baudrillard, returned to these issues as the basis of their cultural and political critiques. Their combination of aesthetic, moral, and political concerns led them to engage with many of the same issues as Ruskin in ways that I think help illuminate the continued salience of his work. To understand this, it helps to go back to Disneyland. This is not just because we are in Los Angeles, or because it is full of strange historicist architecture, or even because I love Disneyland, I do, but because it is one of the best examples of something that is both real, a real place we can visit about which people have very real feelings, and one of the most obviously unreal or fake places that quickly leaps to mind. In his famous 1975 essay, Travels in Hyperreality, Umberto Eco called Disneyland the chief example of the absolute fake, a category and essential element in his diagnosis of hyperreality, the postmodern condition of imitation taking over the real. He wrote, Disneyland's Main Street seems the first scene of the fiction, whereas it is an extremely shrewd commercial reality. Main Street, like the whole city for that matter, is presented as at once absolutely realistic and absolutely fantastic, and this is the advantage, in terms of artistic conception, of Disneyland. The houses of Disneyland are full size on the ground floor and on a 2/3 scale on the floor above, so they give the impression of being inhabitable, and they are, but also of belonging to a fantastic past that we can grasp with our imagination. The Main Street facades are presented to us as toy houses and invite us to enter them, but their interior is always disguised as a supermarket where you buy obsessively, believing that you are still playing. Disneyland, Eco tells us, quote, makes it clear that within its magic enclosure it is fantasy that is absolutely reproduced, unlike other forms of realism which try to reproduce reality. Quote, what is falsified is our will to buy, which we take as real, and in this sense, Disneyland is really the quintessence of consumer ideology. That is, we imagine that our desire to possess the fantasy that Disneyland offers us originates in us, and because we feel it as our own, is an authentic feeling, rather than the actual purpose of Main Street, which is to generate that feeling. Around the same time, French theorist Jean Baudrillard also used this hyper-real quality of Disneyland to analyze the postmodern condition. For Baudrillard, simulation defines modern life because we are surrounded by simulacra, that is, representations that do not refer or relate to any reality, but create their own reality. As he wrote, quote, Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, when in fact all of Los Angeles and the America surrounding it are no longer real, but of the order of the hyper-real and of simulation. It is no longer a question of a false representation of reality, ideology, but of concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus of saving the reality principle. Here, Baudrillard connects aesthetics, architecture, morality, and capitalism in terms of reality or truth and simulation or the fake. For Baudrillard, unlike Ruskin, there is no longer any referent outside of culture, no nature or God, no longer, as he wrote, a last judgment to separate the false from the true, the real from its artificial resurrection, as everything is already dead and resurrected in advance. That is what he meant by the postmodern condition as one of pure simulacrum, a culture with no relation to any reality whatsoever. And yet for Baudrillard, as for Ruskin, this state turns into a horrified search for authenticity. Quote, when the real is no longer what it used to be, nostalgia assumes its full meaning. There is a proliferation of myths of origin and signs of reality, of secondhand truth, objectivity, and authenticity. There is an escalation of the true, of the lived experience, a resurrection of the figurative where the object and substance have disappeared. And there is a panic-stricken production of the real and the referential, above and parallel to the panic of material production. At different points over the last 250 years or so of technological and political revolution, astute observers have felt that a qualitative change has happened. A last bridge has been crossed and burned. A chasm opened between our own relationship to reality and those of preceding generations. What fascinates me here is the convergence of thought among these disparate critics of industrial capitalism. The problem of the cash nexus is also the loss of reality and the frantic search for authenticity. Carlyle, Ruskin, Dickens, Eco, Baudrillard, and Harari have noticed, when everything in the system can be measured through the same unit of market value, indeed can only be measured in terms of monetary price, as there is no other shared cultural system, and as social relationships become mediated through objects, images, and discourse, rather than direct, we find we have no shared referent outside of our own proliferating objects, images, and discourse, and we seem to be surrounded by surface, veneer, the fake, the unverifiable, by alternative realities that spin out of our control. This is not to claim that Ruskin saw these things first or directly influenced Eco or Baudrillard. It is to say that they all observed various aspects of related phenomena, all connected to the history of industrial capitalism. When Ruskin looked at his world, he saw architecture that reminded him of what we see when we look at Disneyland, a series of historical and historicist reconstructions, new buildings with new uses, clothed in the ornament of past ages. Ruskin's ideas about architecture were part of this reaction to the modern world. For Ruskin, the simulation that he observed in modern architecture represented an essential feature of modern society, the reliance on appearance and monetary worth, the reduction of all things to the cash nexus, all energy given to the great goddess of getting on. His emphasis on truth circled back again and again to the fakeness of the world that he saw developing around him, producing architecture and objects designed to deceive, made only to sell, and consumed in order to produce a feeling rather than to perform a function, all of which ignore the real costs to real laborers and natural environments. He posited nature and the artist's ability to see truly and depict faithfully as one possible antidote to this. He was a witness, in other words, to the birth of Eco's hyperreality and of Baudrillard's simulacra. What, then, can Ruskin's ideas of truth teach us in the age of fake news? For me, it helps to remember that these debates about truth, reality, and authenticity have been with us for a long time, and that they are central to the experience of modernity. That does not mean we should disengage with them. Rather, such historical context can hopefully animate our own discussions about holding on to truth in these tumultuous times and help us see the connections between our search for authenticity and the basic truths about our economic and political system. Ruskin protested his society as it changed before his eyes into our own. He noticed changes in the built environment and in social relationships, and he urged people to consider the root of these problems, namely the pursuit of wealth beyond all else, the mechanization of society, and the failure of political economy to consider anything but the economic bottom line, leaving out all consideration for conditions of production that might dehumanize workers or degrade the natural environment. For Ruskin, the only way to understand these aspects of industrial capitalism was to insist on truth, truth to materials and truth about conditions of production. Likewise, he offered an alternative way of engaging with the world, one not predicated on the cash nexus, through his art criticism, namely to learn how to see the world in its entirety, its ugliness as well as its beauty, fullness of detail as well as emptiness. To see truly, he suggested, was to get to the real, where the real is not just the visible world, but the invisible moral order. I will leave you with Ruskin's words from the second volume of The Stones of Venice, published in 1853. It is verily this degradation of the operative into a machine, which more than any other evil of the times is leading the mass of the nations everywhere into vain, incoherent, destructive struggling for a freedom of which they cannot explain the nature to themselves. Their universal outcry against wealth and against nobility is not forced from them either by the pressure of famine or the sting of mortified pride. These do much and have done much in all ages, but the foundations of society were never yet shaken as they are at this day. It is not that men are ill-fed, but that they have no pleasure in the work by which they make their bread, and therefore look to wealth as the only means of pleasure. It is not that men are pained by the scorn of the upper classes, but they cannot endure their own, for they feel that the kind of labor to which they are condemned is verily a degrading one, and makes them less than men. To feel their souls withering within them, unthanked, to find their whole being sunk into an unrecognized abyss, to be counted off in a heap of mechanism, numbered with its wheels and weighed with its hammer strokes. This nature bad not, this God blesses not, this humanity for no long time is able to endure. We need to think about what it means to look to wealth as the only means of pleasure, and maybe start to work toward a society rooted in recognition of people and the natural world beyond their economic use value, in connections beyond the cash nexus, and in a broader and more inclusive search for beauty, meaning, and truth. Thank you.